There are more people on this panel, we swear.
Question 1.
I don't think so.
Okay, you'll be fine. Okay. So, I'll do the names.
Okay.
And then leave it up to you, or do you want to start?
Yeah, just give it up to me.
Okay.
And then you're going to do the questions.
I'm doing questions, yeah.
Should we wait for Richard?
Yeah, we should wait for Richard.
Sorry, I've really spread out now. Do you want to be here? Do you want me to be
Oh,
over?
no. So, what should I do?
You just sit next to me.
Same giant balloons this morning, and I was so nervous. Yeah. Also, the guy was doing it, and he touched my face, and I was freaking out. He's like, "Don't look up, but you have an eyelash here," and he just like smudged my. I was paralyzed, and we were all about to begin. I like didn't even know how to process that. And then he came back after and said, "My supervisor told me to apologize." Yeah. I'll be by you on for Defenders. Oh, yeah, I like it.
Break a leg.
I'm in right now.
Oh, you are? Oh.
It had me logged into the web.
But it won't be possible for the folks. Okay, cool.
It's on YouTube, apparently.
Oh.
That's how we got you logged in. And it's got a Q&A. They're like, are we starting it? Should we start without Richard?
Should we give him like a minute or two?
Should we say we're waiting for him?
We're just waiting for a panelist, so bear with us.
All right. Such plans, just you.
Just the three of us.
Can do jazz fingers.
She just slide off.
Yeah. I know that sound.
Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started here today. Thanks for everyone's patience. My name is John Wilford. I'm Associate People Scientist at BetterUp, and I'm joined with my co-chair, Rachel Cowan, who is a Staff Behavioral Scientist at HUMU. We're very much looking forward to having the panel today. Just a couple of notes before we get started. We do have a couple panelists that unfortunately were not able to make it today. And so what we have is a series of videos where they record their responses. So they'll be with us in spirit. And so we'll play those in the beginning, and then any other comments by the panelists we'll go ahead and do live. So sort of on the fly mix, but we'll pull it off. Cool, so just a little bit of an agenda today. I'll talk about the panelists here in a second, but we want to run through and talk about what is a nudge, what do we mean when we talk about sludge, and then kind of jump into what are the types of ethical issues you might run across if you're implementing nudges in this space, and then we'll go ahead and go with the discussion. So. I'm going to go and introduce the panelists real quick. First, we have Kara Bai, who is a senior behavioral scientist at HUMU, the enterprise nudge platform. She partners with Fortune 500 leaders to design and implement nudge strategies that drive sustained, measurable behavioral change. We're also joined by Richard Landers. Richard holds the John P. Campbell Distinguished Professorship of Industrial Organizational Psychology as an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. He's also founder and president of Landers Workforce Science, LLC, a talent management consultancy focused on auditing artificial intelligence-based hiring systems. He's also a fellow of SIOP, APA, and APS. And then our virtual attendees today are, panelists, Nikki Blacksmith. She's a co-founder and co-CEO of Blackhawk Behavior Science, an assessment firm working to prevent people problems in startups. Nikki is also an adjunct professor at American University. She holds a PhD from the George Washington University and is a member of SIOP. We also will be joined by Katie Salzgiver, who is a user experience research lead at BetterUp, and formerly on the people science team, where she designed and implemented a wide range of nudges with member engagement, coach enablement, and late and missed session engagement. And last but not least, Jordan Birnbaum, who is the Senior Operating Officer at Beezy, a behavioral-based, science-based market research agency. He's previously Chief Behavioral Economist at ADP, where he developed Compass, an award-winning behavioral science-based leadership development solution. Alrighty, go ahead and do the intro. That's good. Thank you.
Okay, I have just a few slides to kind of orient all of us. Some of you may already be very familiar with nudges. This will feel like a refresher, but it's just so we're all starting from the same page. First, this question, what is a nudge? Thaler and Sunstein kind of were the first ones to really describe nudges in a succinct way. If you've read the book Nudge, then you're very familiar, but described as liberal paternalism. Some of the key aspects are it doesn't forbid any options to change behavior, it doesn't have coercive economic incentives, and a nudge should be aligned with a person's own self-interest, and already you're hearing sort of a philosophy behind nudges, like towards goodness, if you will. I also just have up here sort of a spectrum of how people talk about nudges outside of the academic space. Sort of your strictest academic definition is what we heard, as well as it being part of the choice architecture. That's part of like behavioral economics. And then you'll hear people talk about nudges in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's like a research-backed action. Sometimes it's more of like a reminder that helps you make good decisions. There's a lot of different ways people talk about nudges. We're probably gonna use a few of those definitions today, but just so you're aware that there is this breadth. Got a couple examples of nudges in the wild. The one people are usually most familiar with is this like 401k nudge, auto-enrolling in a 401k, and then also what you see at the bottom of the screen, sort of nudging people towards saving more is really a classic from behavioral economics. You can use language that causes people to save more, that's in their own best interest. They're not required to save more. They can always save less if they want. I also have a few examples from our panel. I've got a HUMU nudge on the left. In the middle, we've got a better up nudge, and then we also have Compass from ADP. For Humu, we're nudging people with research-backed actions in order to drive behavioral change in the workplace. For Better Up, we're nudging people towards engagement, coaching enablement, and behavioral change. And then with ADP, they found that they could use some framing and some specific language in email subject lines that caused people to engage more, and that behavioral change was sticky. So then what is Sludge? Simply, Sludge is sort of the opposite of everything that a nudge is. Nudging for evil is sometimes one of the things people will say about Sludge. There are two key things that Thaler called out specifically. It discourages behavior that's in the subject's best interest, and it encourages behavior that is not in the subject's best interest. So sort of either of those. And again, you can kind of hear that philosophical driver behind like not goodness, if you will. If a nudge is about goodness, a Sludge is not about goodness. Some examples of Sludge in the wild. One of the ones that a lot of folks are familiar with is Uber sort of nudging drivers to continue to drive because that's what customers need, but they're actually getting paid less during those times of day, but setting these artificial goals and saying, keep driving, you need to hit X number of dollars today. But Uber just picked that goal in order to get people to keep driving, and it is effective. Amazon has also been called out for using some sludgy practices in the workplace, namely the sort of gamification of the warehouse that has been criticized as causing people to work faster and ignore safety protocols. And then call centers are sort of a Skinner box for humans, and definitely has some sludgy characteristics, including some technology that will nudge people to engage in behaviors while they're on the call, which could be like showing more empathy, but may not be sensitive to what's actually going on in the call, and is collecting a lot of data about those users that could be used to punish them later. So a few perspectives on ethics in this space. One is the sort of set from Molman, which is essentially the heart of what he's saying is we should be really transparent when we're using technology in order to nudge people. They should understand the algorithms, it should be aligned with their best interests, and they should also be really transparent. Landers and Barron also have 3 lenses to identify fairness when developing an audit for AI in high-stakes settings. It's individual attitudes, that's things like justice perceptions, legality, ethicality, morality, that's sort of our guidelines and principles, and then embedded meanings within technical domains, that's sort of like systematic error that's not random. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get the discussion started. So we have a series of questions here kind of aimed at the topic space here. So we're going to start with question number 1. And this will be answered again by by our 2 virtual panelists. The question is, what are some examples of where nudges have been used in a way that posed ethical challenges, either intentionally or unintentionally?
Question 1. Now, the classic answer is likely to be Uber sending nudges to its drivers, encouraging them to keep going. And while that might be really effective from a motivational perspective, it certainly is in Uber's interest as an organization and not necessarily in the driver's best interest, who might be pushing themselves too far and starting to act against their own best interests. But rather than go with the classic answer, I think I'd like to take a step back and say that oftentimes when we're talking about ethics and nudging, I feel that we often miss the forest for the trees. And here's what I mean. I think that the ethical considerations are actually relevant when we consider what it is that we're trying to accomplish as opposed to how we're trying to accomplish it. In other words, if a cigarette company is using Cialdini's principles of influence to market to teenagers, the problem is not that they're using Cialdini's principles of influence, it's that they're trying to market to teenagers, which is good for the cigarette companies and really bad for the teenagers. And so that makes it an inherently unethical thing to do. Not how they're using nudging or how they're using behavioral economics principles to try to succeed. If you think about going over to someone who's upset and just putting your hand on their shoulder and saying, everything's going to be okay, in a certain way, that's manipulation, right? You're trying to affect how they are feeling and how they might behave moving forward. But because your intentions are good, no one's ever going to have a problem with it, and there are no ethical considerations at all. So it's a really complicated issue, but one that requires a lot of thinking about, especially back to the original question of what is it that we're trying to accomplish in the first place?
Although nudges certainly have their beneficial uses, there are times where they can pose ethical challenges. And one of these areas that is particularly concerning to me is the use of nudges to control or modify worker behavior. So for example, Amazon, they have wristbands that use ultrasonic communication to point the worker in the right direction to a certain product they might be looking for in their inventory. But those wristbands are also used to collect information about the employee's whereabouts, including extremely private information, such as how long or how often a worker goes to the restroom. And I think as psychologists, we need to start having a voice in this area and really think about the ramifications of behavioral control using nudges.
That you guys would like to add for the question? Yeah, all right, sounds great. It's new territory.
No worries, I got lots of thoughts.
Awesome,
Don't
thank you.
worry.
All right, for our second question, one of the core tenets of nudges from Thaler and Sunstein is that nudges help users act in their own best interests. However, in business, there is often tension between the business and the employee sees as in their best interests. How can a practitioner navigate the situation to come up with ethical solutions?
Question 2. Now, this is a really fun question because it points us to a much larger discussion that I think all IO professionals find very important and relevant, which is the psychological contract. What do we all expect of each other? What do organizations expect from their employees? And what are organizations willing to commit to their employees in order to have a reasonable expectation of that kind of commitment in return? And I think the most important thing that organizations can do in this regard is to have an intentional and transparent effort to articulate, here's the psychological contract that we are developing with each other. Here's what we are willing to do. Here's what we expect back. Of course, this needs to be a two-way conversation, and it can't just be the organization dictating that this is what the psychological contract is, but rather it needs to be a negotiation between the organization and employees. Ultimately, however, if you're able to arrive at something collectively and transparently and clearly, then the nudges become really easy, because once everybody's aligned on what are the ultimate expectations and how are things going to go when they are going well, and what is each side going to bring for the other, when there's clarity around that, setting the stage to then remind people and nudge people and encourage certain behaviors, that's going to go much better because people will already have been bought in. So I think that when we try to figure out where is the ethical question of nudging employees and what's in their interests versus the organization's interests, the way that we can best address that is by taking a step back and clarifying the psychological contract to answer any of those issues.
Yeah, here's where I have some thoughts. So when we work with clients a lot, who's known for nudges and the technology that we try to do, a lot of the times that I think it's really important to take a step back and look at the definition when you say the best intentions and define what those are. Take a step back and say, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Sometimes I do with clients this exercise called a front page exercise. If you were to take a screenshot, some press were to get the hands on the program that you released, how does your company feel? What would the reaction be? Are you proud of what you've built? Or are you like, oh, that's risky? If you're even like, oh, that's risky, that's a red flag. So you should really be taking that look deeply. And I've seen this happen often within the inclusion space, right? Where you say, oh, we have all the best intentions, it's really important, but then we're only gonna nudge, or you have a program that's only targeted towards minority employees. Is that in their best interest? Is that in the environment's best interest? If you then saw a screenshot of this company is doing a nudge program and they're nudging just, minority employees to act in this way. is that a headline you'd be proud about? And so this exercise a lot, what it helps do is take a step back and kind of evaluate with a more critical eye, what are those best intentions that you're putting forward? I think a lot of times people think about the outcome and they're like, absolutely, who wouldn't want to improve inclusion? But you really have to think of that. If you start from the distal outcome space, you're gonna make a lot of questionable decisions as you're putting together a program of really being intentional about what are the behaviors in the day-to-day that you're trying to drive or what you're using nudges for. So absolutely transparency, buy-in into the program are super important, but even before, what is the purpose? Is a nudge what you need for what you're trying to accomplish? And if you start from just the space of inclusion and these lofty outcomes, it's not gonna be, you're gonna make some questionable decisions along the way.
Thank you, Karabai. Oops. All right, question 3. Are there any common principles that practitioners should keep in mind to ensure that they are nudging employees in an ethical way? When does a nudge become a sludge? How do you communicate what a nudge is to leaders and to employees, etc.?
Hi, everybody. So common principles is I think what I'm going to focus on, because I think this is an important context where we all remember that we are psychologists, and psychologists are bound by ethics codes, and those ethics codes actually provide really useful frameworks to question whether what we're doing is okay or not. I'm sure you weren't expecting like an IRB refresher right now, but I'm going to give you a little brief one. The APA Ethics Code, which I'm sure you all have at your bedside table, is based on the Belmont Report, an enormously important document, and it outlines some specific principles that we should always keep in mind when we make decisions about people. And nudges are fundamentally behavioral interventions. We're trying to influence human behavior, so this applies very, very clearly. These principles, though, we start with respect for persons, which is fundamentally that people have the right to self-determine. And you have to ask yourself with any intervention, nudge or larger, are we taking away people's right to self-manage their own behavior and control what they're doing? I think you have to ask yourself that question. And also anyone who has, part of that, anyone who has diminished capacity should be protected. Are there vulnerable people in your organization that these nudges could take advantage of? And do you take away their right to self-determine by making those decisions? The second of the principles is beneficence, which is to do no harm and to maximize the benefits for the risks that you're taking. Any behavioral intervention has risks. You never really ultimately know how every single person in your organization is going to be affected by what you're doing, but you have to ask that question. Take a step back, take a moment to question what harms are possible and do all you can to avoid them. We also have the principle of justice, which is a complicated one because there are different ways we might think about what's fair and what's just. We can do things equally, equitably, or we can do things based on need. So you might have heard this framework before. There's all sorts of fun memes about it with people standing on boxes looking over fences. The idea that do we treat everybody the same? Is that ultimately what we value as an organization, and is that how we want to treat people? Do we recognize that that by treating people equally, that creates inequity, and is equity what we're actually interested in? Or are we interested in supporting those who need our help the most and trying to treat people fairly that way? And you actually have to take a moment to articulate for yourself, what are your values as an organization, as a team? Which of those do you endorse and why? And then make sure your decisions align with those principles. Then have integrity, which I hope is the easiest. Be accurate, honest, and truthful. So don't not do those things. And the last is fidelity, just to always remember that you are responsible not only to your business, but to your profession. You represent, as an individual, you represent all of us in this room, all of us in PSYOP, and you also are a force for society. You have an impact on the broader world around you. And to remember that we should always take a step back and question if we are acting in the best interests of society, which is such an enormous question, but an important one to reflect on with your team and think about the implications of. Some of the worst ethical abuses occur right at the edge of what might be okay, because people can just, it's obvious when something's destructive, but when something is, this is probably for the greater good, that's the dangerous space to be in. And you have to take a moment to work with your team and actually articulate your values and make sure that your decisions are aligned with those values.
I love the idea of starting from there with those as kind of the site. A lot of times what we see is it's a mandatory program. It's great. Why would it not, make all these things great? And then reality, if you go to what a nudge intervention back to the behavioral intervention standpoint is, some principles that I like to keep in mind are, or at least practices that I share with clients, is make it easy to opt out. It shouldn't be the most difficult thing to say, I don't want to keep getting these, right? You should make that process easy for someone. If not, are you really doing kind of all our practice a service? Another thing that we've found really important is to connect it to things that are familiar to the end user, that don't prohibit those options, right? So another thing that we've seen a lot is like, we want to test this new, skill or this new behavior, and they're really not in the loop at all of why that's important to them or how it affects their day-to-day, how they'll be evaluated on it later. So just more based on this sense of transparency and the purpose for which you're putting these together. And then there should be, I think this is to the kind of do-good aspect of it, you should always kind of assume that you're encouraging a positive behavior, right? And in a way, that's where I really agree with the borderline. That's where I see a lot of people be like, but why would that not be positive? And when I get the really challenging client, I go back to the front page. Let me take a screenshot of, what would you call, what would this nudge look like for you? Let me take a screenshot. If it got in the hands of the Twitter of Richard Landers, what would happen? Would you be destroyed? I don't actually say it like that, but but I think I should. But in reality, if you're looking at these, we've had situations where people, once they see that, they're like, oh, wow, yeah, that's also not even related to this lofty goal that we have, right? So it's also our job to say, if you have this lofty goal of inclusion, let me help you understand the steps that we can do to take it there, and what are things that are nudgeable and what are things that are not suited for nudges. Nudges are not suited for everything either, and it's important to keep that in mind as we're consulting and helping kind of guide this of what that happens. I would say one thing with nudges too, it's very subtle. Sometimes we're not the people making decisions on that. It's some designer in a platform. It's someone in product. It's an engineer. And so, for example, at Humu, Rachel and I are in many conversations working cross-functionally to say, whatever question you put, whatever feature you put, it has to be intentional, because you don't know when nudges are this really subtle aspect of the experience of the user. So we are so used to just thinking of the constructs and inclusion or being looped into the conversations. If you are thinking of a nudge program, you're using some software, you're using someone else, get yourself in that conversation. Get yourself to be there and ask those questions and push on those questions, because designers aren't trained to ask those questions necessarily. Engineers aren't trained to ask those questions, but we are, and it's our responsibility to be in those conversations and push the right design and experience for users.
Great. Thank you, Carabai and Richard. All right, so question number 4. What can we learn from other disciplines to inform the ethical use of nudges in the workplace?
What can we learn from other disciplines to inform the ethical uses of nudges in the workplace? Well, first, transparency is key. Nudges, while subtle, are not meant to trick the user. When concerns are raised by public opinion or ethics are called into question with other regulatory entities, often transparency is a way to help address those concerns. If we get concerned about how we're being taxed, we can, admittedly with some difficulty, access that information we need to understand how and why that taxation is working in that way. The same should be true for nudges. In addition, transparency helps us create an opportunity for members of the public to engage and express their concerns, which can help us identify where a nudge may not be ethically sound. Education is also a common method used by other industries to help ensure nudging is done ethically. By laying out the what, the why, and the how of the nudge, audiences can more easily discern if the goal was for the benefit of the user or the creator of the nudge. It's also common to see the creation of ethical review boards or units assigned with evaluating the ethics of processes used and these can be applied to nudges as well. These cross-discipline groups help determine whether a nudge is too paternalistic in nature and not aimed at promoting the user's benefit. And these can be of a huge value internally at a company to help really ensure that we're doing the right thing.
One area that I think IO psychologists really need to explore scientifically is the effect that continual nudging has on people. Right now, a lot of the usage and the studies are looking at nudges in real time or at a specific moment or in the short term. What we don't know is the long-term impact. How does this change behavior, attitudes, personality, values, interests over a long period of time?
What can we learn from other disciplines to inform the
Moving along. So another question we brought
Question
together.
5.
Excuse me, sorry.
If behavioral
What challenges does technology pose with respect to ethical nudging? What are the ethical implications of algorithmic nudging? Specifically, what IOs should be aware of?
science teaches us anything, it's that context rule. Question 5. If behavioral science teaches us anything, it's that context rules them all. Context is more powerful than any principle, and the circumstances surrounding any event are always going to dictate ultimately what is the right thing to do. And that becomes a problem when we're dealing with technology and AI-based nudging because it's very crude. Basically, we teach machines to look for signals, and then when they see the signals, to do something, to deliver a certain kind of message in a certain kind of forum. And while those are often productive and very well-intentioned, they also have the capacity to go very wrong. So here are 2 quick examples. One, somebody comes into work in a really bad mood, feeling very angry at colleagues and trying very hard to keep their composure, and then they get a nudge over the course of the day saying, hey, today's a really good day to speak your mind and let everybody know exactly how you feel. That is actually a terrible day to do so when you're in that kind of mood, and hopefully it doesn't lead to someone feeling encouraged to go and let loose and perhaps lose a little bit of their own self-control. Another example is we might be nudging leaders to make sure that they're providing enough recognition to their teams. But in one set of circumstances, that could be a good, helpful reminder that makes them intrinsically motivated to do so. But in another, it might make them feel monitored and like they have another box to check, in which case they're going to be doing it through extrinsic motivation, and their desire to actually recognize their team authentically is going to be depleted, so having the exact opposite effect of what we intend. So it's really important that we recognize when dealing with AI-based nudges that we don't have a sufficient understanding of context to be overly prescriptive. And that's the most important thing for us to do with nudges right now when it comes to technology.
Richard, did you want to chime in?
Sure, that's good. Let me open by saying the echo is insane up here, and I don't have any idea what he just said. So if I repeat anything, I'm sorry. So in terms of what are the unique challenges related to technology, I don't think, as perhaps indicated by my IRB speech, I don't think that the fundamental concerns are any different. When we start to add these sort of technological dimensions to classic behavioral interventions. But what does change is that we are much further away from the people that we are designing these systems to influence. Usually when we use behavioral interventions, there is a more human dimension to it. Whereas sometimes when we design these systems and we're trying to create behavioral interventions at scale is a dangerous word, that it is easy to forget that they are real humans on the other side of this equation, of this thing that we are trying to design, and that can put us in more of a, I guess I would call it an engineering mindset, where you're trying to solve a problem versus you're changing the way people behave at work. So I think the unique concern is to resist that temptation. Then when we work with technology this way, to remember that these are people, and that all of our ethics codes and whatnot apply, and to take a moment to appreciate the humanity of the people that we are hoping to change the behavior of, and not to forget it.
I would like to add to that real quick, because as you were talking, something came to mind that actually my wonderful colleague here to the left, Rachel, does. At Humu, scale can make you raise a lot of money, in case you have a startup, but just so the term is very funny. But yes, we think about behavioral change at scale. And one of the things that we have a whole practice in our team that's looking at different characteristics of jobs. And so one of the things that we do is say, we're not gonna blanket approach and say, hey, growth mindset or whatever it might be, looks the same for everyone everywhere. So how do we really take all these aspects into consideration? And I think that's what we mean by scale, but there's a lot of folks, when you are buying software, when you are trying to do this in your company, it is really hard to write, or whatever your program might look like, in such a personalized way that would land correctly. And so just making really smart decisions of the trade-offs of where you're gonna do personalization for a better user experience, and where are you gonna optimize for scale, right? Because you're gonna have leaders that are gonna be like, I want a program for 1 year, which means I need 200 nudges, whatever, I'm making numbers up. But take a step back. Is it better to have 200 nudges for 1 year, or 3 months in a more thoughtful way for a population, and kind of take the time to take the step back and decide it, to make those decisions? All the principles that Richard's referring to apply, but also a lot of what we think about of when you're having that conversation with a client, or your internal client or external client, of really getting to that space again of what is that outcome. Take 3 steps back. From inclusion, usually sometimes what I'll ask clients to say too is, what does that look like? Does that look like someone speaking up in a meeting? Does that look like someone having an opportunity to present information? Does that look like a lateral role? What does that look like? And start to really break down a little bit more this mindset of, imagine you're a person getting a nudge, and the purpose of the nudge and the comm says is to increase inclusion. Someone might say, well, what power do I have to do that? Like, I don't know, great, I think it's great, I'm gonna try to do something here or there, versus saying, we're gonna send you these for you to have better conversations in your meetings. Try it out, let us know how it goes. Super different conversation, super different program that can go really differently. And both sound great, right? You just have to be really thoughtful about how you position that. And if you, again, start in that like lofty outcomes distal space, you'll make those decisions where you're gonna be optimizing for that and not the end user.
So question 6, for a practitioner who becomes aware of nudging initiatives in their organization, what can they do to ensure the program or a vendor is using this technique ethically?
What can we learn from other disciplines to inform the ethical uses of nudges in the workplace? Well, first, transparency is key. Nudges, while subtle, are not meant to trick the user. When concerns are raised by public opinion or ethics are called into question with other regulatory entities, often transparency is a way to help address those concerns. If we get concerned about how we're being taxed, we can, admittedly with some difficulty, access that information we need to understand how and why that taxation is working in that way. The same should be true for nudges. In addition, transparency helps us create an opportunity for members of the public to engage and express their concerns, which can help us identify where a nudge may not be ethically sound. Education is also a common method used by other industries to help ensure nudging is done ethically. By laying out the what, the why, and the how of the nudge, audiences can more easily discern if the goal was for the benefit of the user or the creator of the nudge. It's also common to see the creation of ethical review boards or units assigned with evaluating the ethics of processes used and these can be applied to nudges as well. These cross-discipline groups help determine whether a nudge is too paternalistic in nature and not aimed at promoting the user's benefit. And these can be of a huge value internally at a company to help really ensure that we're doing the right thing.
I'm going to add some notes here. I would say be ruthless. When you're evaluating a vendor, you're evaluating someone, these are your people at the end of the day. I mean, I'm on the other side, so if you're ever talking with me, bring it on. No, but I'm 100% being honest here. I think you need to be ruthless. A lot of the times nudges are super subtle and they're not the thing that comes up in the sales conversations at the beginning or when you're putting your program together. Be ruthless. Ask, have you had backlash in any of the programs that you've rolled out? If so, how? What are examples of behaviors? Or if you see, for example, a demo and you see even something as small as a little button or a little feedback loop, what is the purpose of this feature? What is the purpose of the behavior trying to drive here? Because all together, it's going to be a part of your program. I think the third thing is when you go into these conversations, understanding what are KPIs that are important to them. You are going to have your own important outcomes and KPIs that you're looking at, but listen a little bit closely to what they find important too, because it's going to tell you a little bit too about what they're prioritizing behind the scenes. So I think it is helpful to ask those questions too. What type of user data do you collect? What do you collect it for? Kind of pressure test on some of those, the type of data they're collecting and what role it plays in the system that a user would have. Again, be ruthless. I do think that's our role here and I say it as a part of someone who offers this service. When someone doesn't come with that concern, I almost question if they've done their due diligence to think about what a nudge program looks like at their company. We see this a lot too with worker types, different worker types, right? A lot of assumptions of what a nudge can do and kind of a blanket approach. We generally optimize for the knowledge worker, but there's actually millions of workers out there that don't work at a desk. Is something going to land correctly or not? How much have you thought about that and put that in place before? And how much can the software support that? Or whatever technology you might be looking to use or the program that you're trying to design, how much have you factored in that context and that environment that will really shape the experience?
Thank you. All right. For our last question, for academics, what areas do we need to explore in order to better understand unethical uses of nudges and their impact?
As scientists, I think IO psychologists have a lot of room to explore and contribute to the science on nudges. For example, one area that we're actually making great strides in is understanding how artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms inform hiring decisions. We can use that research and expand on it to understand how nudges manifest and what kind of data is being fed into the machine in order to make the determination of whether or not someone needs to be nudged. It's also going to be critical to really understand worker attitudes around nudges, and mostly because a lot of the times it's highly overlapping with surveillance. And that space is growing, and we as IO psychologists need to keep up our understanding of how it's being used in the workplace.
So I think in terms of what we need to do better, in terms of research, maybe where I'll focus what academics means. The tendency for IOs and IO research is to approach the problem of nudges, I think, from a very scientific standpoint, meaning we want to have general rules about how nudges work. We want to have general rules about what the impacts are, how people feel about them. I think that's actually a quite dangerous mindset. I've written before on the difference between scientists and engineers in terms of perspective. I think this is one where we need more of an engineering perspective, because the damage of nudges or behavioral interventions like this are not done on the average person. The damage is done on the fringes. When we talk about, when we worry about things like DEI, we're not worrying that on average every person is disadvantaged. We're worried about the edge cases. We're worried about the people who are being uniquely disadvantaged that we are not quite aware of and not quite familiar with. In the technology space, this would be called emergent complexity. The idea that the interaction of teams and bad leaders and the technology being used, and it's all the combination of all those factors that can uniquely harm an individual in a way that is not necessarily obvious to us if we're only examining things in terms of mean changes or percentage changes or some of the common metrics we examine. So I think a high priority, something that we have to do, is get better at understanding the edges, that it's not purely about did we make things better for the average employee, but rather understanding, to the extent we can, and it's an enormously complicated problem, but to the extent we can, understanding the effect on every employee and understanding how to better predict and to better understand what those implications might be. Yeah, I think that's the biggest need moving forward.
Thank you, Richard. Unfortunately, we're right up at time. I think it might be a little bit difficult to get discussion questions in, but I think you can feel free either to reach out to any of the panelists or myself. Happy to chat further about the topic, which I think we're all pretty excited about. But so we want to thank everybody for joining today. Our three virtual panelists, Nikki, Jordan, and Katie, as well as our two panelists here, Richard and Karabai. So if we can give everybody a hand. Thank you all very much.